Hi, welcome to Quietly Thinking Out Loud. Before I begin today, I like to say thank you. I may never know your name or where in the world you are listening from. Thank you for spending a little of your time with me. And perhaps more importantly, thank you for thinking with me. Today I found myself reflecting on something I have been quietly observing for many years. Over the course of my life, I have been fortunate enough to travel to many different places, mostly because of work, but also because I have always enjoyed visiting new places and seeing different parts of the world. And there are places I remember simply because they were beautiful. I've always loved older cities, walking along streets paved with cobblestones, standing quietly in front of structures that have stood for hundreds of years, looking up at old cathedrals, admiring the details carefully carved by human hands many centuries ago. The great domes, the intricate stonework, the extraordinary craftsmanship. And whenever I find myself standing in places like this, I rarely think only about the beauty. I find myself thinking about the people who built them, the patience required, the craftsmanship passed through generations, the determination, the vision people must have carried to create something designed to outlive their own lives. And interestingly, those places often remind me of home because we have our own temples and historic structures that have also stood for hundreds of years. Different cultures, different beliefs, different histories, yet somehow I see the same thing. Human beings, regardless of where they come from, have always been capable of creating extraordinary things when they commit themselves to building something meaningful. And standing quietly in places like this, I often find myself asking the same questions. What lies beneath? Because what we see is always the visible outcome, but what interests me most has always been what exists underneath. Perhaps this way of thinking comes partly from my profession. For many years working in organizational development and human resources, we often use something called the Iceberg Model. Above the surface, we see visible things like performance, behavior, success, conflict, achievement, results. But beneath the surface, we find the things quietly shaping everything above. Beliefs, values, mindset, fear, drive, motivation, discipline, aspiration. And over time, I realized life works very much the same way. And throughout my travels and professional experiences, I kept noticing similar patterns. When I was much younger, there was a period in life when I thought I had been given too much responsibility too early. Like many young people, I quietly believed life had not been entirely fair. There were things I wanted but could not have, responsibilities I carried while watching others live more freely. But traveling changed something in me because I began seeing how many people live with struggles far greater than the ones I thought I was carrying. Real struggles, the kind of struggles where survival itself becomes the priority. And I remember realizing something important. Nothing in my own life has changed, but the way I saw my life changed completely. Perspective quietly teaches us gratitude. But over time, I began noticing something else. No matter where I went, I kept seeing a similar pattern in people who seemed focused to grow. I remember working with teams in different places and being deeply impressed by how eager some people were to learn. They asked questions, they stayed curious, they wanted knowledge, not simply to improve themselves, but because they believed learning could build a better future. I remember running a workshop many years ago when one participant politely approached me and said they hoped I would not mind because they planned to film the entire session. Not for management, not for reporting, but because others who could not attend needed to learn as well. I remember smiling and joking with them by saying, "Next time, please tell me in advance so I can dress properly and possibly put on some makeup." But privately, I remember feeling deeply impressed because I realized I was witnessing something important, the hunger to learn. And over many years, I noticed something remarkably consistent. The same pattern exists everywhere in society that continues developing, in organizations that continue growing, and even in people who eventually rise to the highest levels in their career. It is rarely intelligence alone, rarely talent alone. What I often notice is something quieter, the desire to improve, the willingness to keep learning, the belief that becoming better is always possible. And perhaps that is the invisible force beneath so many extraordinary outcomes. Belief. The belief that growth is possible. The belief that human beings can become more than what they are today. And perhaps this is what has fascinated me all my life. Not simply what people build, but what quietly exists beneath what they build. Because whether we are talking about great structures that survive centuries, thriving societies, successful organizations, or individuals who continue growing throughout life, what we see on the surface is rarely the whole story. Something invisible is always holding it together. And maybe life quietly teaches us these same lessons over and over again. That what eventually rises above is often shaped by what lies beneath. Belief, drive, discipline, curiosity, aspiration, and perhaps most importantly, the quiet belief that we can become better than who we are today. Well, thank you for being here with me again today. Until next time, take care.